So I'm going to talk about what causes AS, or ankylosing spondylitis. And to my mind, this is a sort of holy grail because most, if not all, the treatments we currently use are not in any way curative, and if you stop them, the symptoms will come back. But if we understood really what caused the disease, it might be possible to stop it happening, perhaps with diet or a vaccine, or to cure it once it's come. Unfortunately, we are not at that stage yet. So what do we know about the causes of AS? And most of this research has been done on ANK-SPON, so I'm going to use the word AS. What we do know is that it's caused by both genetics and environment. It's not infectious, as far as we know. And the genetic contribution is bigger than the environmental contribution. So of all the different kinds of arthritis, AS is the one that runs most in families. And our genetics is, of course, comes from our genes, which we inherit from our parents. And I'm going to talk a bit about that. And I'm going to talk about HLA-B27, which is the gene you will almost certainly have heard of. I'm going to tell you what that is. I'm going to briefly mention where we think the environment contributions come from, and they're obviously important. And then in the second part, I'm just going to mention those other related cousins, the other conditions associated with AS. And make the point that whether we call this, I prefer to call these conditions immune-mediated inflammatory diseases, or IMIDs. That's a long term, but I'll try and explain why I think that's a good term. So studies done by my wonderful colleague Paul Wordsworth, who many of you will know. He was very influential in a lot of the early research into the genetics. And one of the studies they did was studying twins. If you compare non-identical siblings with non-identical twins and identical twins, you can estimate how much of their condition is inherited. And they came up with a figure of about 90% inherited. Now, I suspect that is probably a slight overestimate, but it's still very high. Now, we now know from many studies, which Paul and I to a lesser extent, but Paul a lot has been involved in, that there's over 100 genes involved. So it's not like eye colour or something like that. But the most important of those genes is the HLA-B27 gene, which might be about a quarter of the entire susceptibility to disease. Now, about 90% of people suffering from AS carry this gene, the B27 gene, but it's important to say it's actually very common. So 9% of the UK population will have this gene. In some countries, in Greenland or Norway, northern Norway, it's much higher. In other countries, sub-Saharan Africa, it's much lower. But in the UK, it's about 9%. So most people with B27 are entirely healthy, and indeed, it's probably doing something that's actually good, although it's obviously a downside for it to be so common. And I'll come on to that as well. So what is HLA-B27? I try to avoid flying, but this was to a medical conference, and I was very chuffed to be told to go to gate B27, since that's what I was talking on at the conference. So HLA stands for human leukocyte antigen, and they're different to blood groups, but because they're on the white blood cells, but they're the things that you get matched for if you are going to donate a kidney or bone marrow to someone, because they are important in controlling the immune system. And if you're not matched when you have a transplant, the other person's immune system will reject it. So we all inherit genes from our parents, and it turns out we inherit an A gene, a B gene, and a C gene. They're all related from each of our parents. And that gene then makes a protein, and the protein is an important part of our immune system. And this is a cartoon of the HLA-B27 protein. And you would have a body cell here. This is magnified millions of times. And on the surface of the body cell in lovely purple is the B27 molecule, and it's got a partner here. And in yellow, I'm showing what we call an antigen. And that's often a fraction of a virus or a bacteria. So no one had ever heard of T cells until COVID came, and now everyone knows about them. But these are the things that T cells recognize, particularly the cytotoxic or killer T cells. And my PhD was actually mostly looking at flu, which wasn't very popular then, but is clearly important. And I showed that people with HLA-B27 made fantastic immune responses to flu. And my supervisor, Andrew McMichael, who's an amazingly famous immunologist, he also showed that people, for example, who were infected with the HIV virus, if they carried B27, they made a better immune response against HIV and lived longer. Luckily now we have antivirals. But B27 does protect you against AIDS, protects you against severe problems from hepatitis C as well. So it's actually very good at doing this job that it's supposed to do, which is stimulate your immune system. And here's the T cell, the cytotoxic or killer or CD8 T cell shown in red, which recognizes your B27 molecule with one of these peptides. Now, I said those peptides are they're supposed to be things like viruses or cancers that we want to get rid of. But of course, sometimes it's part of yourself that's seen there. And maybe if that's recognized by your own T cells, they would start to attack your joint. So one theory of disease is that there are peptides in our joints that unfortunately stimulate an inflammatory T cell response. I would say that theory isn't proven, and there are other things that B27 seems to do that could be causing disease as well, and it may be multiple factors. And my sort of theory is that B27 is like a volume knob on your immune response, and it turns your volume of your immune responses up higher than other people's. So it can be turned up to 11, if you know the Spinal Tap film, 11 out of 10. And that can be good if you've got an infection, but if you don't have an infection, it can trigger SPA. So in summary, and if you have the B27 molecule, you always have it. It's not like an antibody which can come and go. That's your genetic makeup. And the way we test here in Oxford is we actually send a blood sample and they extract the DNA in a lab across in the Churchill, and then they look for the specific B27 sequence. So that's HLA-B27. But as I've said, we know there must be environmental factors as well, because although you're born with all your genes, you don't develop AS usually until your 20s. There is a childhood form called ERA, which happens in teenagers or younger kids. But the adult form you don't develop till you're in your 20s. So what changes between being born and being 20 that might trigger AS? And we don't know, but one of the things we've done a lot of research in and still very active is, could it be the contents of your guts? And the microbiome, there's a lot of interest in this. The microbiome is basically describing all of the organisms that we share with our body. And it turns out we have more bugs inside our guts than cells in our body, which is a bit of a weird thought. And for people who have donated blood to my research, we have just published this paper in one of the science journals, Science Translational Medicine, together with collaborators. Fiona Parry's the head of Kennedy Center across the road, Curtis Hartenhau's in Harvard, and we compared the poo, not to put too fine a point of it, and thanks also to research nurses at the back who helped collect these. We compared the poo of people with AS, rheumatoid arthritis, and psoriatic arthritis, and in fact children with JIA, and it turned out to be enormously complicated, and unfortunately this area is really, really complicated, because we all have millions and millions of different bugs in our gut, and it's dependent on so many things, what we've been eating, antibiotics, whether we were breastfed as a child, all these things, whether we've got pets. But it does turn out that there were things in common. In fact, what we found in this study, which wasn't what we were expecting, was actually all the people with the inflammatory types of arthritis had a common sort of change in their gut bugs, which reflected the inflammation that was going on. Now, this is what we call a cross-sectional study. We just took one sample from people. So we can't show with a cross-sectional study whether the gut bugs caused the disease or whether disease caused the change in the gut bugs. And that's just how science works. So I think the jury's still out. There are other studies from other groups, including a good one from China, where they suggested that even just having the B27 can actually change the bugs inside your gut, which is really intriguing and needs further work. So my feeling is it's likely to be important, but we haven't proven that yet. So I definitely would advise against having a microbiome transplant, because that can potentially be dangerous. But I think things like probiotics and prebiotics are a really interesting area, and I would definitely encourage people to look out for good quality research on those areas. And then just finally, I wanted to discuss this issue of the cousins of AS and what's actually going on with all these diseases. So David has actually mentioned, here's the MRI scan showing the sacroiliitis and the later changes in AS. But people with psoriasis can get SPA. People with SPA can get psoriasis. People with SPA up to, in fact, if you've had SPA for 40 years, your chance of getting an eye inflammation called iritis is up to maybe as high as 25%. So painful red eye, go to the eye hospital, get it checked out, because this is treatable but important to treat. But also, many people with SPA have upset tummies. Scopes show the often low-grade inflammation, and in up to 10%, people actually develop Crohn's or ulcerative colitis. And we know there are common genes from all of these studies have had genetic studies. They're common genes, and this pathway that Claudia mentioned, the Th17 pathway, a particular part of our immune system. So it's different to our allergic immune system. It's probably an environmentally developed to help us fight bugs in the gut, for example, and parasites. But this seems to be increased in all these conditions, although, as I've mentioned, the treatment still seems to be different. So the reason I like the term immune-mediated inflammatory disease is it doesn't say we are sure that there's a self-antigen that's causing disease, and we don't say it's an infection, we just say it's driven by an overactive immune system.